Hi, everybody. This is the Hungry Math Professor here, and thank you for coming to my channel. And today I want to start discussing Against Method by Paul Feyerabend. And I've decided that this book is long enough and I'm enjoying it enough to do several parts. So this is part one, where I'll discuss chapters 1 through 5. And there are 20 chapters in total, so there'll be a few more parts to come, more discussions of what Paul is saying. Paul lived from 1924 to 1994, and the first edition of this book was published in 1975. And the book was supposed to be with two authors, one being Paul Feyerabend and the other one being Lakatos, who they really disagreed about a lot of things, but they respected each other's views. And Lakatos thought it would be interesting to put that together into one book where they sort of respond to each other's views. Unfortunately, Lakatos died before Paul finished the book, and so they weren't able to do that. But the first edition was published in 1975. The third edition was published in 1993, and that was right before Paul's death. So that was the last edition where Paul was able to make changes. So there were three editions of that type, and there are several prefaces where to different editions in this edition as well. But then there was a fourth edition published in 2010, which added a introduction by Ian Hacking, who was the same person that wrote an introduction for Thomas Kuhn, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, which I also recently read. Yeah, I'm really enjoying this book, but it's also the kind of book that I think is easily misunderstood and is easily going to split the room. You're either going to love or you're going to absolutely hate what's going on here. I happen to be on the side that I really enjoy it. And so I'm going to try to give you some reasons why I feel that way, but I also understand why people don't like it. I mean, he is intentionally trying to disrupt things a bit and call your attention to what he thinks is the underlying sort of chaos of it all. And so that can really piss people off where you kind of poke the bear like that. But also maybe he's just clearly wrong, and maybe what he's doing is really dangerous. And I think that's how people who find Paul frustrating would probably want to say something like that. Let's start with chapter one because he starts with a zinger right away, and I think he proclaims this idea that, let me just read it, the section heading. The only principle that does not inhibit progress is anything goes. And here he's specifically talking about progress in the sciences. You could take him to mean this more broadly, but of course, this is going to fly in the face of certainly philosophy of science, where there's going to be various different approaches to philosophy of science, but none of them are going to say anything goes, right? They're going to give various different, uh, conceptualizations of how science should operate, has operated, and it's going to be something very systematic. And basically, Paul's view in general is going to be any systematic view is going to have made the mistake of not being correct. Like you just can't possibly completely contain something in a system like that, right? Let me try to read a few quotes that are related to this idea of anything goes, and I'll discuss it some more as we move forward here. So from the very beginning of this of chapter one, he says, the idea of a method that contains firm, unchanging, and absolutely binding principles for conducting the business of science meets considerable difficulty when confronted with the results of historical research. We find then that there is not a single rule, however plausible and however firmly grounded in epistemology, that is not violated at some time or other. This is in part, similar to the things that Kuhn was saying, that that no sort of theory of science has like completely fit all the facts. But the difference, of course, is Kuhn then gives a theory about what science does, right? Science goes from a period of revolution where we're going to change the paradigm because too many anomalies have sort of crept up in the theory of science that was currently being adopted. And then a revolution happens and a new paradigm comes into place. And then a new period of normal science happens where the paradigm is established and we just keep kind of chipping away at it and solving problems. And Paul's going to go a step further and say that, he's clearly, he never really uses the word normal science, and he's not going to talk about normal science because for him, um, you'll see that it's kind of better to have multiple theories around multiple points of view, and you can use these multiple points of view to test and to make progress. And so anything goes should be seen in this sort of pluralistic sense that, but also in this like sense of there can't be one system that possibly describes all of science and or describes the history of science, right? Again, that's something Kuhn was saying too, that we need to go back to the history of science because the stories that the physicists are telling us or that the philosophers of science are telling us don't seem to fit the history of science, right? So what's going on? Another quote, however, here as elsewhere, simple philosophies, whether of a dogmatic or a more liberal kind, have their limits. There are no general solutions. An increased liberalism in the definition of fact can have great repercussions, while the idea that truth is concealed and even perverted by the processes that are meant to establish it makes excellent sense. I therefore again warn the reader that I don't have the intention of replacing old and dogmatic principles by new and more libertarian ones. For example, I am neither a populist for whom an appeal to the people is the basis of all knowledge, nor a relativist for whom there are no truths as such, but only truths for this or that group and or individual. All I say is that non-experts often know more than experts and should therefore be consulted, and that prophets of truth more often than not are carried along by a vision that clashes with the very events the vision is supposed to be exploring. I think something I want to emphasize here is that I think it's easy to read Paul and think he's against science. And this to me is a gross oversimplification of what's being discussed here. Yes, Paul is going to be inflammatory. He's going to push your buttons and he's going to say controversial things, and that might lead you to feel like he's against science. But I think that is a real unfair interpretation of what's going on here. Perhaps he's being irresponsible in the way that he's talking about science. That's a different claim. But I think to say that Paul's against science is to really misunderstand him. I mean, the way I read this book, I mean, there's, just to talk a little bit about the writing, there are just so many footnotes, and the footnotes are like sometimes longer than the text itself. I mean, it's a little chaotic, right? It may be intentionally chaotic. But what the footnotes say to me, what I see in the footnotes is just a person who is incredibly curious, almost like a kid just kind of running around the playground and trying to explore all kinds of different things. It's someone who's clearly very deeply curious about science, the history of science, current science as best you know, the philosophy of science, and he just wants to understand as much as he can and put it together. For me, to see this as a choice between science or not science is to have made the mistake that Paul is trying to get us not to make, that there is no such choice, that instead, like we're a part of this human experience together, and we should just be curious, and we should think of it as like an artistic endeavor that we're trying to, as humans create meaning for, this kind of a thing. He doesn't say those words per se, but that's my sort of spin on how I think you should read this. But I really think it's a mistake to say that Paul is somehow against science. That is a real gross misunderstanding of what's going on here. So let me continue to read a few quotes. So here in one of the prefaces, he discusses this idea of anything goes. So he goes, anything goes is not a principle I hold. I do not think that principles can be used and fruitfully discussed outside the concrete research situation they are supposed to affect. But the terrified exclamation of a rationalist who takes a closer look at history. Reading the many thorough, serious, long-winded, and thoroughly misguided criticism I received after publication of the first English edition, I often recalled my exchanges with Lakatos, how we would both have laughed and how we have been able to read these effusions together. I like this idea, though, that this is the terrified exclamation of a rationalist who takes a closer look at history. At some point, Paul goes to work with Popper, and at some point he describes being, very much interested in the logical positivists and then the falsificationism of Popper. So I think this quote is to that point. Like he wants to be a rationalist at some point in his life, but as he looks at history and as he looks at the philosophy of science and things, he just can't help but exclaim, like, it's not there, right? It's just not there. And we can tell these stories about science being super rational, but from his point of view, and the history of science just doesn't seem to suggest that. And again, Kuhn says something similar, but not as maybe not as extreme as that. And a few more quotes. Let me warn you that it is not my intention to inform, or to establish some truth. What I want to do is to change your attitude. I want you to sense chaos where at first you notice an orderly arrangement of well-behaved things and processes. I think this is important, that this is what he's trying to do. If you read him and you're trying to figure out what is his system, then you're reading him wrong, right? That's not his goal. He's trying to get you to think. He's trying to get you to ask questions, to question the foundations of science, to question the stories that philosophers of science tell you. And he's going to give you lots of different reasons to do that. But at the very end of the day, he said, I want you to sense chaos where at first you notice an orderly arrangement of well-behaved things and processes. And then the last quote I'll read, and then we'll move on. He says, single-mindedness in pursuit of any goal, including truth and understanding, yields great rewards. But single vision is folly if it makes you think you see the truth, the one and only truth. Hence the need for the counter-irritant maxim, anything goes. And I do like this pluralism point that he's going to make in several places in this book. And I think it's important to say, from my point of view, what I think the pluralism is here. It's not about purely the proliferation of ideas or theories. That's in part of pluralism, but I think a lot of times what we see today is a lot of different theories out there, but then we see people dug in behind their theories as well and dogmatically defending the position that they find themselves. So yeah, we have the proliferation of a lot of theories online and things like that. But what we don't necessarily see, from my point of view, is the kind of pluralism where you don't just dig yourself behind one of the theories out there for you to dig yourself behind. Instead, you try to understand all the theories that are out there. You try to reason through them all, and you try to understand them, and you try to let them wash over you. And it's not to say that you shouldn't stand up for something at the end of the day. You will, because that's a human thing. We will choose our values and stand up for things. But to have taken the time to the pluralist project of really understanding all the different positions out there and really putting yourself in the shoes of other people's positions, I think is beneficial to us as society to create cohesion where we disagree. And I would argue that currently we don't see that kind of pluralism, at least from my point of view. And that's a really important part of how I see pluralism and how I read Paul's what he's saying. But Paul also considers himself or he likes to say that he's like a Dadaist artist. If you're familiar with Dadaism or not, you should check it out, Google it, see some art there. It's interesting to look at. And this was a revolutionary anti-establishment art movement that was after World War One, and it's very much reacting to the senselessness of World War One. That just it was awful, right? And so many people died, and this trench warfare and tear gas and all this terrible technology that just killed people efficiently. And they saw this as just a failure of traditional society and a failure of rationalism, right? So this art was responding to that. And Feyerabend sees himself as a Dadaist as well. He's trying to disrupt. He's trying to get you to question rationalism and what it has brought about in society. And I think that's an interesting way to read Against Method as well, from my point of view. I'm reading this as a piece of art in the sense that I'm not always trying to figure out exactly what Feyerabend's trying to say. Instead, like when I look at an abstract piece of art at MoMA, I don't always ask, what is the artist trying to say? For me, I like to think of it as this is a piece which informs my conversation, makes me feel a certain way, and makes me think a certain way. And that's what's important, right? And the artist only has so much control over how I react to it. And the same thing here. If you try to put this book into a box and say, what is this book about? It's about this. Again, you're doing exactly what Paul doesn't want you to do. You're trying to systematize his work, and he's trying to criticize systematization, right? So instead, I like to think of this, just take this book and see how it makes you feel. What does it make you think? and have discussions with people about it. If it makes you angry, great. Why is it making you angry? What don't you like? And that's useful. I think that's important, right? And that's what I think he sees himself as an artist in the sense that he wants to try to make you feel things. He wants you to ask questions, and he wants you to question the status quo. Okay, let's step through a few of the first chapters before I end the first part of the discussion of this book with you together. So in chapter 2, he introduces an idea which he's trying to counter the idea of induction or the idea of normal science from Kuhn, where you have an established paradigm and you run more experiments to establish that paradigm. You try to shore up the different ideas about the theory. You try to approximate the constants occur in the theory, so on and so forth. You just try to reinforce the current theory. And Feyerabend wants to give us another way of thinking about it. And so he says, to see how this works, let us consider the rule that it is experience or the facts or experimental results which measure the success of our theories. That agreement between theory and the data favors the theory, while disagreement endangers it, and perhaps even forces us to eliminate it. This rule is an important part of all theories of confirmation and corroboration. It is the essence of empiricism. The counter rule corresponding to it advises us to introduce and elaborate hypotheses which are inconsistent with well-established theories and are well-established facts. It advises us to proceed counterinductively as opposed to induction in science, right? So you can criticize him in saying he said he doesn't want to introduce theories and structures to things, and the first thing he does is introduces a method, right? He says he's against method, but isn't this a method? Yeah, I think that's true to some degree, but again, he's only going to bring this up for a few chapters, and you shouldn't take him as providing this as a method, but it's also the kind of method that's a little bit in the spirit of anything goes, which is not exactly the kind of method you expect from a systematic theory, right? And what is counter-induction? So what is he saying? He's saying that like you have some established paradigm or some theory in science, and he's saying that you should consider theories which are perhaps completely inconsistent with the theory you have in mind, maybe even fly in the face of some of the experimental results you have, maybe even flies in the face with all the experimental results you have, maybe just flies in the face of some, so on and so forth. And why does he say that? Because he's going to go on to say it's kind of like a useful thought experiment. When you have two theories that compete with each other, it will inspire good experiments to decide between the two theories. That's important. It will also get you to think about the world differently, so that'll open your mind to new ideas. And he sees this generally as a good thing. Like the more theories we have and we can compare and contrast, the more good ideas that we'll have, the more thoughts, more people will bring into the mix, and so on and so forth. Of course, I think, it's limited to how many theories we can tolerate as human beings. I don't know that you should take Paul as literally, suggesting a certain amount of theories. He never gives a number or anything like that. But, I don't know. So I don't want to give a specific number, but certainly like 2 or 3 theories that are competing with each other doesn't seem to be such a crazy idea, in one area of science instead of sort of one paradigm that we follow. What does that look like in practice? We can ask questions about how reasonable that is. Is it efficient? Things like that. But part of what Paul's going to do in the next couple of chapters is give us examples from history where this was the case. And not only just that this was the case, but he's going to focus on examples that we tend to love from the history of science. And he's going to show us that, yes, this is an example you should love from the history of science, but this person acted counterinductively. They didn't, they flew in the face of the actual experimental evidence at the time, and it worked, and so what's so bad about that, right? As we move forward, in chapter 3, he's going to talk about the proliferation of theories and how, we need, we can have many different theories, again, as I said, and pluralism. But again, when I think you have to take his when he talks about the proliferation of theories, he's not saying that so that you have a better choice, so you can choose one or the other. At least that's not the way I read him. It's like you want more choices, more flavors of ice cream so you can pick the one you love the best. Rather, you're supposed to proliferate these theories, but then consider them all and play them against each other. It's about widening your sandbox, not about picking one flavor out of a larger assortment, in my mind. And I like this idea of like widening the sandbox and having a lot more theories to play against each other. But when he says that, he's also quite provocative, because in chapter 4, he talks here. I'll say there is no idea, however ancient and absurd, that is not capable of improving our knowledge. Okay, now this he goes on to say some things that are a little bit, uh, maybe even offensive to some people. Like, for instance, he talks about how even creationism and the Bible and these different myths from ancient history can inform science. That's a hard thing to swallow as someone who appreciates science. It's certainly not the thing that we usually tell ourselves as people who love science. I'm a mathematician. Sometimes I might call myself a scientist. I'm not a scientist, but as a mathematician, I definitely tend to, uh, you know, identify closely with scientists. And usually the story that we tell ourselves is that science is better than these myths. Science is better than religion, right? And I'm just being honest with myself. There are some scientists and mathematicians who are Christian or other religions, but in my experience, it's not typical. Um, and usually scientists will not, let any kind of religious faiths or myths or astrology and things like this, or voodoo and all these kinds of things, have anything to do with their science. So here, Paul is being very inflammatory. I mean, he's really trying to push our buttons. But I think he's trying to knock science off of its pedestal. Again, I don't think he's trying to say we should not be doing science. This isn't a choice for Paul between science and religion or science and myths or anything like that. Again, it's always about increasing the number of stories for Paul and increasing them and letting them play against each other, letting them speak to each other, not about replacing science with something else. But, you can ask the question, like, what does, young Earth creationism, which says something like the fossils that we see, which are evidence of what we see as evidence of evolution, they'll say something like all those fossils were put there by God. What does that theory have to tell evolution? Right? What is that? What's the significance of that? I'm not so sure, right? What does Paul have in mind? He doesn't necessarily dive into that example. I think what he does have in mind about religion is that religion tends to focus on spirituality, or it tends to focus on the meaning of human life, and it tends to focus on thinking about death and trying to comfort people about that. And I think part of what he's trying to get us to notice is that science in its abstraction is very efficient and it solved a lot of problems, but perhaps science has left behind some of the more important things that make us human. Why are we here? How should we live? How should we live morally? How should we take care of people? And these different religious faiths and these myths, perhaps what we can learn from them is to focus on these deeper questions that are important to humanity and not always focus so much on the abstractions that come with science. That's one way of thinking about it. But again, he's also trying to be inflammatory. He's trying to push your buttons, so don't forget that. And at the end of chapter 4, I think there's an interesting quote. He says, "It is possible to retain what one might call the freedom of artistic creation and to use it to the full, not as a road of escape, but as a necessary means for discovering and perhaps even changing the features of the world we live in." Again, this analogy of art for Paul is always coming up. He was very much interested in theater. He acted, I think, on the side, and he was very much interested in art and all these kinds of different things. So for him, it's again about increasing the things that we explore instead of like partitioning the world down into all these different pieces, different areas of science, different areas of all these things. It's about kind of breaking down those barriers and seeing it all as a part of like the human experience, right? And the freedom of artistic expression, even in science. Again, that's something that I think scientists generally don't like to think about themselves quite that way. I think we do think about, as mathematicians and scientists do sometimes attribute creativity to what we do, and I think there is creativity to the things that we do. We don't usually describe it as the same kind of creativity of that we when we describe like what an artist does, where there's like a real true kind of uninhibited freedom of expression, or at least that's the way we tend to talk about it. And then the last chapter that I want to discuss in this first part, chapter 5, where he says, no theory ever agrees with all the facts in its domain. It is not always the theory that is to blame. Facts are constituted by older ideologies, and a clash between facts and theories may be proof of progress. It is also a first step in our attempts to find the principles implicit in familiar observational notions. So again, this was something that Kuhn says as well, that no theory ever agrees with all the facts in its domain. And Paul goes on to give many examples in this chapter, and then he's going to focus in the next couple of chapters, which I'll discuss in part 2, on the story of Galileo and the different ways in which the facts did not align, and also in the ways in which Galileo was able to change the course of history, change the course of science in a meaningful way, but in a what he thinks is a counterinductive way. I think it's worth, reflecting on this. No theory ever agrees with all the facts in its domain. Again, I think this is somewhat geared towards philosophers of science who tend to create these stories that seem a little bit more absolutist about sciences. But I think scientists tend to be pretty pragmatic and would even admit that, yeah, of course, like, our theories are really good, but they never completely agree with all the facts. That's I think, an easy thing for a pragmatist scientist to admit. But maybe for some of the philosophers of science who want to present a much more stronger sort of realist position about science, that this can be a bit problematic for them. Okay, so that's my first discussion of Paul Feyerabend's against method. Uh, I hope you at least have been able to think. If you love it or you hate it and you have comments, please comment. I want to hear what you have to say. If you hate it, then try to express that, but then also try to give me something to work with, and I'll probably comment back. So please like, comment, and subscribe, and I hope to see you at another video, maybe even part 2 of Against Method.